Expressed on the following sponsored program are strictly those of the host, guests, and callers, and not necessarily those of this station, its staff, management, or sponsors.
Are you a family caregiver? Are you caregiving for someone who can no longer take care of themselves? Are you overwhelmed? This is Caregiver Solutions Info with Marcia Teal. Marcia will be hosting an hour of true stories and information, tips and updates of the latest research and necessary information in the caregiving field, focusing on you, the family caregiver. An Alzheimer's disease and dementia care expert, Marcia has 15 years of hands-on experience at Arden Courts, a leader in assisted living dementia communities here in the U.S. Marcia covers everything you need to know as a family caregiver, especially if you care for a loved one with Alzheimer's disease or other related dementia or chronic illness. If you have a friend or relative that is also a family caregiver, call them now. They won't want to miss a minute. And let them know they can watch on caregiversolutions.info. And they can listen on WNN 1470 AM in South Florida or nationally on the iHeartRadio app. Now, sit back, relax, and learn from our host, Marcia Teal, as she brings information to you that may just be the caregiving solution you need.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to Caregiver Solutions Info Show. I'm so happy you could join us today. We have another fantastic program for you. If you're a caregiver or know a caregiver, this show was made especially for them. This is an educational program for caregivers that have been in the trenches for a while, or brand new caregivers that have just started that journey, or people that might become caregivers. Because a new caregiver is born every single day. And unfortunately, there's no college you go to learn how to be a caregiver. It's very difficult because you're learning as you go by experience. So this show is provided so you can learn, you can understand what your options are, you can be educated, because the more a caregiver has education about caregiving, the chances are the challenges will be lessened by that. We provide expert advice from people in the field that caregivers need to hear from, including physicians, elder law attorneys, geriatric care managers, social workers, even caregivers, because there's no better way to learn about caregiving than to, actually identify with caregivers that have already trodden that path. So whether you're joining us by local radio, maybe on your phone, on the iHeart app, or you're watching us live, and we are live from Boca Raton, Florida, on your smartphone or your computer, I'm glad that you found us. This is going to be an hour program with lots of information, and we will be giving away a free book that's great for caregivers halfway through the program. So make sure that you have a pen and paper handy to write down that special number. So today we're going to talk about something that not a lot of people want to talk about, a lot of people don't talk about it, but everybody needs to talk about it, and that's about dying. And dying is a part of life. It's a natural progression. We are born, and our whole life we're aging, and at some point everyone will die. How they die, when they die, that's going to be different for everybody, but it's guaranteed that everybody will die. And people sometimes don't like to talk about that. They shun away from it. But especially when you're a caregiver and you're caring for somebody that has some type of dementia, especially Alzheimer's disease, it's very difficult because they call that the long goodbye, because Alzheimer's disease can last from 2 to 20 years. And so as someone is aging, they're also declining, and the long goodbye, and part of that long goodbye is watching someone, basically wither away. And I think it's important for everyone involved in caregiving to understand what happens when a person is in that actively dying process and how to manage it. And we're going to talk about all of those things today. So it's going to be very important for people to understand this. And I'm so glad that I have experts with me today. They're going to help explain all of this. They are from TrustBridge Health. TrustBridge is a hospice organization here in Palm Beach County, and also they cover Broward County here in South Florida. And I have two experts have been in this field for many, many years. They have a lot of experience, and they've come today to help us understand all about hospice, about the care, about the process of dying. So I'm very happy to welcome to you today. We have Dr. Karen Kennedy. And hi, Dr. Kennedy.
Hello.
Welcome.
Hello. Thank you.
And we also have Lori Carpenter. Hi, Lori.
Hi, how are you?
Thank you for coming.
My pleasure.
Dr. Kennedy is board certified in anesthesiology and also in hospice palliative care. She is the Assistant Chief Medical Officer currently with Trustbridge Health. Lori is a licensed clinical social worker, and she's also the facility liaison for Trustbridge Health here in this area. So I'm so excited that you all have been able to come today, been looking forward to this conversation, not because, again, people like to talk about this, but it's so important, and at some point everyone is going to experience this in their life with a relative or a friend. And I think that we need to, talk about this so everybody's prepared. So the first thing I want to ask is basically, what is hospice? Because I know people know the word. I mean, it's been around for a number of years, and people know the word hospice. But a lot of people think that means a person is going to die in a week. And that scares them. It's a scary word for a lot of people. So I want to set the record straight for everybody. So let's talk about what is hospice. Doctor, you might want to address that because you actually are board certified in palliative care, which you can explain that at the same time.
So hospice and palliative care, all hospice is not palliative care, but palliative care is in hospice. So in other words, palliative care is really looking more at quality of life, dignity of the individual, choices as far as either how we're going to live our life, what medical treatments they're going to undertake, versus, and basically at the early end of a disease. So, for example, if you're diagnosed with Alzheimer's at the very beginning of the disease, if you have cancer when you're first diagnosed, or perhaps if you have heart or lung disease. So it's important to look at the palliative aspect, and that aspect has to do with, again, symptom management, dignity, looking at healthcare surrogate, advanced directives. And back to your point, it's not about if and when we're going to die. The choice is how that's going to happen. And I think that's very important. So palliative care will play a smaller role in the beginning of the disease when you're first diagnosed. And then as the disease progresses, you'll play more and more and more of a role to where perhaps at that point when your life expectancy is, according to what the guidelines are for hospice. By the way, doctors didn't make that up. It was done by legislature and Medicare. Okay, good
life
to know. Expectancy
Yes.
of 6 months or less with the natural progression of the disease. But that means that you can live longer, and so we're okay with that.
So but the word hospice, I mean, what in general, is a hospice basically there to manage this process? To lend services to somebody, because, like you said, it could be that they're on hospice for a longer time, and we know that now that it's false. That it's true that someone could be on hospice and die within days or a week. I mean, that's absolutely true because people can be admitted under hospice services at very late stage.
One of the reasons that people die so quickly under hospice care is because they have often been given a late, what we call a late referral. And because of the misconceptions and the myths that people hold about hospice, they are often reluctant to consider it until it is very, very late in the game.
So I'm glad you brought that up, Lori, because when people hear the word hospice, oh, my uncle went on hospice and he died, 5 days later, it almost sounds like by going on hospice, it killed the person.
Absolutely.
But that is a false idea, and talk more about that and why that is an idea.
It becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. If you continue to come only at the end, then we only get to take care of you for that short period of time. And you talked, what is hospice? Well, first of all, hospice is a lot of things, but it's an entire team of professionals headed off by the doctor, and the heart of the team really is in the nurses. It's a very nursing-based program. The nurses are eyes and ears and are in constant contact with the doctor who has the authority to make the final decisions about medications, about treatments. But hospice is also so much more. You know, when we talk about relief of pain, it's kind of in a hierarchy. The bottom of that being alleviating physical pain, and then going up the levels of the triangle, then we talk about psychosocial, emotional, and spiritual pain.
So there's pain associated in more than just the body that you can address, is what you're saying.
Absolutely.
Wow, that's really interesting. So it sounds like, to get right to the point, is that being under hospice care, when you're eligible, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute, is a good thing, because it can address all of these issues that otherwise people would have to sort out for themselves. Right, Lori?
I can't think of it, and I'm an ambassador for the organization on and off the clock. I can't think of any other way I would rather die. 90% of people die as a result of a life-limiting illness, while only 10% die instantly of a cardiac event or something of that nature. Exactly.
Like that.
And it provides so much comfort for both the patient and the family, which is also very important.
Yes. But so why do people wait until the very end to seek help? Because you said a lot of people wait too long. Why do they? Are they afraid of what might happen? Are they in denial? What gives with that?
All of the above. I always say that there are two H words in Florida: hurricanes and hospice, and those are the two things people fear most. I think there is a stigma. I think there are misconceptions. I think people think if I talk about what my wishes are about dying, it's going to bring it on faster. And instead, just the opposite is true. And if you lay out what your true wishes are, you're doing your family such an enormous favor. You don't want your children to have to play God or at those emotional times.
Or make those hard decisions.
Absolutely.
That maybe there's no agreement in the family, because, I mean, I obviously talk to families all the time and caregivers, and when one of the family members might bring up hospice, the other family member, they just kind of open their mouth and look shocked, like, oh my God, why would you say that? Right? And there's not an understanding between the parties. So this is one of the reasons I think is very important to talk about this, because to get people on the same page. You know, what is it that you're really saying? Hospice isn't to hurt, it's to help.
Yes.
Correct. Yeah.
You want to ask questions. Do you want to be in an intensive care unit? Or do you want to be in a bed surrounded by loved ones and your dog and your cat? You know, where do you want to spend those final weeks and months?
And live the rest of your life. So we take care of seriously ill people, and it's not for the end of their life, it's for the rest of their life. And most people don't say, oh, I wish I would have came to hospice sooner. All of them say, I should have had this earlier. Or later. I should have had it earlier. Well, I could have been on hospice for so much longer and have this team surrounding. And when you go back to caregivers, there are a lot of studies that show that when hospice is involved, the bereavement and the grief that happens with especially a spouse and with the caregivers is dramatically lessened when hospice has been involved.
Interesting.
Because they've been helped through that journey.
Because they're educated, too.
And they've been supported. They have somebody to call. They have a routine. They have a break if they need it. They have all of those little things that are put together, and we'll talk a little bit about exactly what hospice provides in one kind of package.
Okay, and we will do that right after our first commercial break. So stay tuned. We'll be right back with Trustbridge Health.
Arden Courts is not just a place to live, it's a place to call home. Residential living combined with quality caregiving. This is the philosophy behind Arden Courts. Communities created exclusively for individuals with Alzheimer's disease and related dementia who would benefit from a safe and structured environment. For additional information about any of the unique services Arden Courts provides, call 888-478-2410 to locate a community nearest you. Inquire about our educational seminars, resource library, or support groups, or simply feel free to ask questions you may have about Alzheimer's and related dementias. At Arden Courts, we know, we understand, and we can help because memory care is all we do. Remember, call 888-478-2410 for additional information about any of the unique services Arden Courts provides.
Feelings of depression, isolation, and frustration are common among persons living with Alzheimer's or related dementias. It's common among those who care for them, too. It takes a lot of patience and courage. It also takes knowing when you can no longer do it alone. At Arden Courts, memory care is all we do. Talk to us. We know. We understand. We can help. Don't let guilt keep you from making the right decision. Visit arden-courts.com. Arden Courts follows equal housing opportunity guidelines.
And dementia care expert on caregiversolutions.info. If you have a question or wish to share a story, call into the show at 888-565-1470 and talk with Marcia. Now, back to Caregiver Solutions.
Welcome back to Caregiver Solutions. I'm Marcia Teal, your host, and my special guests today are from TrustBridge Health. I have Lori Carpenter. She's a licensed clinical social worker and facility liaison for TrustBridge here in Palm Beach and Broward County. And with her also is Dr. Karen Kennedy. And Dr. Kennedy is the Assistant Chief Medical Officer for TrustBridge Health. And they're both here to share their expertise. We're talking about dying and hospice and what that means, what that really means. So we've had some great first comments here about hospice and what it is and why it is. My next question to you, Dr. Kennedy, is are all hospices the same? And if not, why not?
So there are many different categories of hospice. So there are what we call large hospices, which are hospices with more than 500 members. Majority of, I think it's about 60% of hospices actually have 40 patients or less. So a majority of the hospices in this country are actually smaller hospices.
And is that by choice or by law that they have to be in a certain size?
So most of it has to do with either population in the area. South Florida, obviously, there's a little bit larger concentration of patients. And as well as the different states have things like what's called certificate of need. So, for example, Florida is a certificate of need state. That means that you have to have permission from the state to be able to open up a hospice company in a specific county, and it's a county by county. So, for example, Broward County has, I believe, 7 hospices. And here we have essentially 3 hospices. So each state is different, and some states have no certificate of need. So, for example, I believe it's Massachusetts has 40 hospices in the state.
In the state, 40 different hospice organizations.
In the state.
I was going to ask you about that because I've traveled and I've been to a lot of states, and I go to Texas quite frequently for Arden Courts. And when I find out about their hospices there, and they tell me how many are in the area, I'm like, are you kidding me? Because I'm used to 2 or 3 here. So it's every state is different.
Correct.
What you're saying.
So
okay.
a state that does not have a certificate of need tends to have a lot more hospices. So, for example, home health agencies, there's no certificate of need in the state. So I believe there's almost 300 in Broward County alone.
Right.
Exactly. So they do that, I think, to look at quality. They do the same thing with nursing facilities. They do it with hospitals. So then that way they can control some of those so that, for example, the home health agencies, if you have 300 of them, more than 50% of them have, like less than 5 people. So they're looking more at being able to provide better quality. So it's large and small.
Okay.
We look at open access and not open access.
What does that mean?
So open access are hospices that allow you to continue some of those palliative treatments that you've been getting when you come onto hospice services. So some of those treatments would include radiation. If you have a painful bone metastasis from cancer, you can get radiation, blood transfusions, sometimes some chemotherapy, physical therapy, speech therapy, some of those things that help with the quality of life and improving your function and preserving dignity.
And others, you're not allowed to have that.
Others don't do those things. Correct.
Okay. And that's just by the way that
decision
they're
of
set
the
up?
hospice. Correct.
Okay.
The rule from Medicare is that what you do for one patient, you need to do for every patient. So if you decide you're going to offer blood transfusions or drainage of fluids in the chest, you have to offer that to everybody.
All right. So that's a hospice individual decision of what services they want to provide.
And some of those services we are not reimbursed from Medicare for. We are able to pay for those.
None of those
through
services.
the donations to our foundation.
Correct.
Okay.
So that goes back to profit and not for
All
profit.
right, that's a
There you
good,
go.
good segue. So yeah.
So for-profit obviously is a for-profit, and you have a not-for-profit. For example, a for-profit is able to, as Lori alluded to, accept donations, and then we can use those to subsidize. So, for example, our particular company has a complex case management, and people can donate to that and provide those additional services, because the rule says that you have to provide all of the medical care that's needed for that patient for palliation of symptoms, for the diagnosis that they're on for you. So if you have a cancer patient that needs radiation, you need to pay for those services if they're considered part of good palliation and treatment for that patient while they're on your services.
Because Medicare doesn't pay for that, is what you're saying.
Not when they're on hospice. You almost become like their little insurance company when you're on. So you're responsible for all the medical services for that diagnosis. So if it's something like Alzheimer's or dementia, you're responsible for all the care that's related to the Alzheimer's or dementia.
And how is that different from a not-for-profit?
So it all depends on what you would like to cover. So a not-for-profit can accept donations and use donations to subsidize the care.
I see. Okay.
So, for example, charity care, some of the donations we have subsidize that care. And we're also able to do special programs. We have a pet therapy program. We have a music therapy program. Those are all paid for by donations.
I see.
All by donations. We wouldn't be able to have those programs if they weren't paid for by donations.
Bereavement services as well, and we offer bereavement services for up to 13 months following the death of a loved one for anybody in the family that is identified as needing emotional support.
Okay. So basically then, if you have a lot of hospice organizations, there's a lot of choice. If you have just a few, then you have fewer choices. But really, it doesn't sound like there's too much difference between services. Am I reading that right? Or do they all generally have similar services?
So you have to
as far as the medical services.
Right. Medicare requirement requires that you have social worker involvement, chaplain involvement, physician oversight. It does not require that you have a physician visit. So that also is how the hospice approaches it. There's a few hospices that just have a physician that answer phones and they sign all the paperwork.
Okay.
We actually believe in having very involved physicians.
Face-to-face
and our
type?
doctors see about 3,000 patients visits, touches a month, which is amazing. I mean,
So that's important
they're all
to
different.
know.
So you need to go shopping for hospice.
Okay, that's basically what I wanted to find out,
Yes.
because they're
Yes.
not all the same.
No.
Because hospice, like you said, makes their decisions of what services
Correct.
they want to do,
Correct.
and they can be very different depending
Yes.
upon
Yes.
what a person's needs are. You know,
Yes.
for not just medical, but for everything else. So thank you for explaining that.
Definitely do your homework.
Yeah. Okay. Good to know. And we already talked about there's, a few to choose from in this county, but plenty of other places have so many. So it would behoove somebody to find out about that and ask those questions.
Yes.
And again, this is why we're talking about this, because a lot of people don't know the first question to ask. You know, how do I know what to do? How do I know what to choose? How do I know when to make this decision? Which basically lends the next question is when it is appropriate for someone to consider hospice care. Is there a special time? Lori said earlier before we went to commercial break that people wait too long, right? They wait too long, and then they sometimes pass away right away, which then families feel, oh, if I hadn't put them on hospice, this wouldn't have happened.
Right.
But, you hear that all the
All
time.
the time.
But
All the
that's
time.
not the case. It's
No.
because they waited too long to get this kind of
Right.
service. So when is a good time for people to think about maybe this is the time to talk about hospice?
Well, some of it depends upon the diagnosis, and some of it depends upon your goals and medical criteria, and I'll certainly let Dr. Kennedy take the medical criteria. But for somebody who's, say, a cancer patient, there are times when you're getting the treatments and the goals are no longer delivering what you're looking for. Do you want to spend 6 months of your life losing 4 days a week to being in bed and miserable?
Like on chemotherapy?
Exactly. Or do you maybe want a few less months, but a a far greater quality of life and a far greater ability to participate in life. So if you've reached a crossroad where you are no longer seeking heroic measures, that's a point to consider hospice care. And there are a number of people that are working on your team. Sometimes the doctors are very well educated about hospice care and are frankly more pro-hospice and will recommend it on the earlier side. There are other doctors that are perhaps not as knowledgeable and
or want to do maybe what the family wants, like keep trying everything you can try.
Yes.
Do this test.
Well,
do this thing.
Yes.
Keep going.
So it's
out
about
of desperation sometimes.
Yes.
Right?
It's about doing the right treatment to the right patient at the right time.
There you go.
Because it's not always the treatment to be given at a certain time. So what I might give somebody today is not what I could give before. And so a lot of times I'll hear, but I want my mother to have. But it's what your mother would have wanted. And so what I tell them is if mom could climb out of bed and look at herself, what would she say? What would she want? And the law says you need to make the decision that they would make if they were the ones making the decision. So looking back at when do you make the decision, especially specifically looking at dementia, you look at the loss of skills, decreasing eating, change in sleeping more, losing weight, and it's really all about function. So the most positive predictor that someone's life expectancy is going to be short is the loss of their performance status over time. So they go from walking, now they can't, now you have to stand them, take 2 steps and sit. Now you can't take them out of bed at all. They were feeding themselves, now they can't do that. Those are the predictors that someone's going to have a shortened life expectancy, and that's, believe it or not, with most diseases. So that's when I would start looking at hospice.
When you see these like major
Absolutely.
changes.
Right. You touched on the patient versus the family, and so often, and it is with no judgment, it's a horrific emotional struggle for the family. Sometimes far worse than the patients, to be quite honest.
Absolutely.
I was a social worker on a team for a number of years, so I was down there in the trenches with patients and families, and they feel desperate and fearful and guilty and grief-stricken, which causes them to be put in a position to make horrible decisions, which is one of the reasons we also are such proponents of clear advance directives.
Yes.
Well, needing to know before you need to know.
That's right.
What to do with a loved one that is now in this situation.
Right.
So to prevent all that. And we say here all the time, prevention and being proactive and getting your legal documents in place,
Absolutely.
the living will, your DNRs, your healthcare surrogate, all of that. Very, very important.
Because it changes the conversation. It changes the conversation to
Yes.
my mother would like,
Yes.
which is a very different conversation to I want my mother. Because to Lori's point, you don't really know, or you have some unresolved conversations, and so when you're making the decision and it leads that way, it's so much better for your family. It's amazingly better.
Yeah.
I recently learned that some hospices actually require a DNR in order to sign on, and some do not. That's another thing that is worth researching.
All right.
And the other thing I wanted to say is that one of the things that we do as a team is address all these family needs and concerns, and I wanted to talk about hope. Another thing that people think is that choosing hospice means giving up hope, and nothing could be farther than that from the truth. It may mean changing hopes. Maybe you can't go to the beach and lie on a blanket, but maybe we can drive you by the beach and you can smell the ocean. Maybe you can make contact with that cousin who you've lost touch with and you may feel some unresolved issues. Maybe we can move your goals up a little closer and clean things up.
To give people peace. I think that's what the whole point is everybody wants peace. They want a peaceful passing. Everybody says, I hope I die in my sleep, because then it would be peaceful, right? And when we come back from our next break, we're going to talk about how people go about getting those services and how they do it. So we'll be right back. Stay tuned.
Feelings of depression, isolation, and frustration are common among persons living with Alzheimer's or related dementias. It's common among those who care for them, too. It takes a lot of patience and courage. It also takes knowing when you can no longer do it alone. At Arden Courts, memory care is all we do. Talk to us. We know. We understand. We can help. Don't let guilt keep you from making the right decision. Visit arden-courts.com. Arden Courts follows equal housing opportunity guidelines. Somewhere at the corner of bewildered and confused is a lost mother, a father, a sibling, a grandparent. Wandering is a common symptom of Alzheimer's or related dementias and can often make those who care for a loved one feel just as lost. If you're looking for a place that's safe and secure, look to Arden Courts. Memory care is all we do. We know. We understand. We can help. To learn more, visit arden-courts.com. Arden Courts follows equal housing opportunity guidelines. Being unable to recognize the obvious often occurs with Alzheimer's or related dementias, even among their caregivers. When the time comes for you to decide that someone you love needs more help than you can give, will you be able to recognize it? Don't wait for a crisis to make the decision for you. Talk to Arden Courts. Memory care is all we do. We know. We understand. We can help. To learn more, visit arden-courts.com. Arden Courts follows equal housing opportunity guidelines.
Alzheimer's disease and dementia care expert on caregiversolutions.info. If you have a question or wish to share a story, call into the show at 888-565-1470 and talk with Marcia. Now, back to Caregiver Solutions.
Welcome back to Caregiver Solutions Info Show. We're talking about hospice and unfortunately dying, but it's an important, very important topic. And with me today are representatives from Trustbridge Health, giving us the knowledge that we need to know to help our loved ones and to help our loved ones help us when the time comes. So Dr. Karen Kennedy is with us, as well as Lori Carpenter is a licensed clinical social worker for Trustbridge Health. And we talked about when is an appropriate time to consider. And now my question is, so a family says, okay, we think it's time. What's the next step? How does someone get onto hospice and what is involved?
Well, for one thing, a family member can actually call themselves and have somebody come for a consultation.
Is there a charge for that?
No,
or?
absolutely
Nope.
not.
Okay.
Ultimately, you will have to get an approval and a written order from a community physician as well as an agreement from a hospice physician.
Like your own doctor.
Correct.
Mm-hmm.
What the doctor that you're seeing out in the community as well as one of our doctors have to agree that if the disease were to follow its natural course, it wouldn't be unexpected for the person to be gone in 6 months.
And 6 months is that criteria that we mentioned at the top of the show. However,
Yes.
You can live more than 6 months.
however,
Right.
yeah, so when people say, yeah, my mom's been on hospice for a year and a half, how is that possible?
Well,
and I'd like you to explain that.
Particularly with Alzheimer's disease,
Yes.
where the trajectory is so much longer than, say, a cancer diagnosis or even a cardiac diagnosis. Our patients stay with us a great deal longer. When we're serving patients in assisted living facilities and nursing homes, where we serve a large number of our patients, we have patients at Arden Court that are under hospice care. Patients live even longer. Patients have a tendency to live longer under hospice care than not because they're getting so much extra support and extra attention.
So when 6 months comes, and that's the magic number we're looking at, obviously the doctors are making their best medical assessment regarding that. However, a person can actually get better a little bit, they rally, or they're still with us after
Correct.
6 months. So in that case, do they get recertified?
So that certification and coming onto hospice is solely up to the discretion of the hospice medical director. So correct. So our job is to look at the patient. What is the natural course of the disease? Sometimes we get additional blood work. We weigh the patient. We look at the function, and we do a good exam, and we try to figure out, with our best knowledge and what we know from medical statistics and journals and studies, what would be the prognostication. So when we say at 6 months, our goal as a doctor, as a hospice doctor, is to say, still would this patient have a life expectancy of 6 months or less? And that certification is solely up to the medical director in hospice, not the community physician.
Right.
Right.
And so they get to go on and under the care and continue for another
Correct.
6 months. And then if they're still here, that process starts all over
Exactly
again.
right.
Exactly.
Continues.
Also, very important to know that this is not a lifetime contract. If for any reason, at any time, the patient or family does not want to stay, Johns Hopkins calls and says, we've got a brand new treatment, come on up. You sign a piece of paper and you're off, and you go back to your traditional Medicare benefits, and you can go on as you choose.
That's good to know that people can change their mind.
Yes.
Absolutely.
And change. And also the fact that, they make that decision in the beginning, but what happens when the person seems to be better and all of a sudden they're gaining weight instead of losing weight, and they seem to be doing better, which we see a lot with Alzheimer's patients. Then what happens? Do they get off of hospice?
Sometimes we graduate patients, and we make a smooth and seamless transition for them back into the community. We realign them with the physician that they were seeing. We make sure that all of their medical needs are transitioned
Correct.
back into
Including
the community.
medication, prescriptions,
Right.
making sure that that's all taken care of.
Okay.
Correct.
Does that happen very often?
The percentage?
I think it's 2%.
Yeah.
I'd have
Okay,
to get
small
the exact
percentage,
number.
right?
Not-
But a
Right.
small percentage
Yes.
where they can go off. But
Correct.
then later down the road, when they get worse again, they can go back on to have that
Absolutely. In
option.
fact, we keep a close watch on the patients that,
All right.
that have discharged. Also, patients who leave our services, it's not like, oh, I'm sorry you left, you can't come back. It's quite the opposite. We are here. We are ready with open arms to take you back in if and when you choose to do that.
That's very good good information, really. What happens? Have you ever had a case where one doctor, because you said two doctors have to concur
Yeah.
that a person has 6 months or less to live on this earth? Have you ever had an occasion where the two doctors did not concur? They had different opinions.
Really?
Does that ever happen?
Never happens. The guideline or the rule is that it's sole up to discretion of the hospice medical director, with or
In that
without
case.
with or without collaboration with the community doctor.
Okay.
Admission
Even
to
for the-
hospice is solely based on you can only a hospice doctor can admit, and only a hospice doctor can discharge, quote unquote, no longer terminal, etc. Yes, it is not up to an outside physician, and you have to be employed by the hospice. That's the rule.
As opposed to a contracted doctor or
So
something.
I have an example today
Sure.
where the family wants the patient to come on hospice. The physician says, I don't believe the patient's terminal. So we came in and we did a palliative consult in the hospital. We talked to the family. We felt at that point that the patient did have a shortened life expectancy, and the patient will come onto hospice. And that's really what the family wants.
So basically, the hospice physician can overrule the other doctor as what they think, as they have the last word.
Right, it's not so much overrule. It's just the Medicare guidelines say admission eligibility can only be determined by the hospice medical director.
Okay.
So I don't want to call it so much
Yeah.
overruled, but yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
In essence, that's
Yeah,
what happens.
yeah.
But they're going by the Medicare rules.
Correct.
Which leads me to my next question. We may have already talked about it, but I just have to do the straight question to you, is how are hospice services paid for? Who pays for all of that? I know you mentioned that some services that you may provide or any hospice may provide come from donations, but what about the regular services? How are they paid for? Do families ever have an obligation?
So all of the hospice services related to the terminal diagnosis under which they got admitted are completely paid for by Medicare. Sometimes people want to continue to see their individual physician. In fact, that's very frequent. They've been living down here for 30 years. They're on a first-name basis with their physician. They've become almost part of their family. They may continue to do that. That is paid for under their regular Medicare benefits and not affected by the hospice. We also pay for all of the medical equipment that we provide. We pay for all incontinence supplies that are needed, and we pay for all the medications related to the hospice diagnosis, which would obviously include any pain or comfort medications as the disease progresses.
Right. And then, so hospice gets paid a daily rate, and it's by the level of care.
Okay.
So what they consider routine home care, which would be somebody who was at home and you were caring for your loved one, and then nurses would come in and visit and provide nursing and aides and the social workers and chaplains and medical visits, but there's not an acute symptom that needs to be managed.
Okay.
Then we have crisis care, which is paid at a higher level because it's where there's a nurse placed at the bedside to manage a symptom that requires a nurse at the bedside.
All the time?
It's 20. It can be up to 24 hours. Sometimes it can be just 12
Up
hours.
to, depending upon what they need.
Absolutely. We have
Okay.
some families that are good managing during the day, but the patient is up all night and they need some assistance, and so we'll put a nurse in there in the evening to help take care of them. So it does not have to be 24 hours, but it has to be criteria that meets a nurse at the bedside. The other would be our inpatient units, which is the same as that crisis care, except we do it in a hospice unit.
Well, it's so funny how you
Yeah.
always just segue right to the next question. It's like you are so amazing because I'm thinking I wanted to bring up the point that there's basically, I think, 3 places that people can receive hospice care. One is in their own private home,
Which is the
right?
majority of our patients, by the way. People also often think, I'm going to go to hospice. You don't go to hospice.
Hospice goes to you.
We're a service delivery, not a place. We come to you wherever you, literally wherever you are.
Yes.
We have served homeless people.
Yep.
We've served people who live under a bridge. We have no restrictions
You go
on
to
that
them?
whatsoever.
Oh, yeah.
Yes, we do.
So
do
if your
daily
home
deli-
is under a bridge because you're homeless
Yes.
and a person needs
And you choose
hospice
to live there.
services.
Right. Some
Yes.
people are homeless by choice.
Yes.
Ultimately, they'll usually end up in one of our inpatient units at the end, usually either at Gerstenberg or the care center.
Uh-huh. So in your private home, wherever that may be,
Right.
you know, in a condo, in a big mansion, or under a
Yep.
bridge, right?
Yep.
Or in a community, a facility like an assisted living, or in an independent living, or in nursing home,
Correct.
right? And the third one that you brought up were your specialized units that you have usually in hospitals or care centers.
Correct.
So those are the 3 in general ways, which pretty much covers where anybody is living at the time.
Right.
Yeah. And do the services vary from one place to another? Is there any difference in services that you would provide?
Whatever, again, going back to whatever services the company provides, it's the same no matter where they
No
live.
matter where.
The
Right.
only difference
And
is in a facility, they have their own bed. We might not supply a bed, so
Right.
those kind of arrangements are a little bit different if you're in a facility, but the services and the opportunities are the same.
Yeah.
And it's based on patient needs. That's another very
Correct.
important thing. The traditional medical system is such that the doctors are kind of the authority figures, and you go in to seek their advice. Hospice is very patient-centered. We are here to serve you. You're the one who sets the goals, and we are here to meet those goals in any way that we can.
Right.
And there was a 4th level of care that we didn't get to.
respite.
Okay.
Very important, respite. We will pay for a person who's in their private home to go into a nursing home for up to 5 days at each given stay in order to provide a break for the family and the caregiver. As a social worker, respite care is not a luxury, and it's not an option, it's a necessity.
Absolutely.
60% of caregivers, particularly when we're talking about the Alzheimer's population, actually predecease the person that they're taking care of. That's very frightening.
That's because of the stress.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And they have their own medical issues. I mean, if you're caring for somebody and you're ill, you need to get your colonoscopy. Or if there's a bar, bat mitzvah, there's a wedding you want to go to, you should be able to do that. And so that we're here to help you do
But they
that.
tend to ignore that. They tend to ignore their own medical needs.
oh,
They're
oh.
not, no. I have a very dear friend in California, and his mother was struggling with Alzheimer's disease for an extremely long time, and he was absolutely adamant about not placing her. And he finally found a wonderful facility, and he was diagnosed with multiple myeloma and was gone in a month.
After his mom went into the facility.
Wow.
Wow. See?
You have to care
Wow.
for the caregiver. It's
Yeah.
very important. And I tell families that too. And sometimes they'll say, but I don't, they don't want to leave or they don't want to move them. But it's important if you don't take care of yourself, you have to care for the caregiver.
That's right.
Very important.
Right. The
It's very
caregiver
important.
can't continue to care for that person if they're too sick.
Right. And they're always, even when someone has their loved one in a community, in an assisted living, they're still a caregiver. I don't think they
Absolutely.
realize that
Absolutely.
because, yes, there are people that are helping with your activities of daily living, and you have, aides and employees that are there to do things for that resident. But that family member is still a caregiver. They're still making those decisions, those choices,
Absolutely.
and they
Yeah.
have to be there for that person. I want to clarify, Lori, again, what you said about the respite. How much is allotted by Medicare for that special respite service?
5 days, and then they
Per
There's no limit.
No limit, right. It's 5 days, and then if you
Can
take
only be 5
a
days in a
one-day
row.
break, and then you can do 5 more days.
So it's not 5 per year?
No.
Or month?
No.
And sometimes there are even situations where they'll have somebody there, and then they'll pay privately for one night, and they'll continue with another 5-day stint.
Okay, good to know. Well, we're going to take our last break, and we'll be back with more from Trustbridge Health Hospice Organization. So we'll be right back.
The inability to recognize the obvious often occurs with Alzheimer's, particularly among the family members who care for them. When the time comes for you to decide that someone you love needs more help than you can give, will you be able to recognize it? Don't wait for a crisis to make the decision for you. Talk to us. We know. We understand. We can help. Arden Courts. Wandering is a common problem for people with Alzheimer's or related dementias. It's also a problem for family members who care for them. Keeping them safe and secure means never letting your guard down. And even though deep down you know it's time, it hurts to have to ask for help. But it could hurt them even more if you didn't. We know. We understand. We can help. Arden Courts. Feelings of depression, isolation, and frustration are common among persons living with Alzheimer's or related dementias. It's common among those who care for them, too. It takes a lot of patience and courage. It also takes knowing when you can no longer do it alone. At Arden Courts, memory care is all we do. Talk to us. We know. We understand. We can help. Don't let guilt keep you from making the right decision. Visit arden-courts.com. Arden Courts follows equal housing opportunity guidelines.
Remember, call 888-478-2410 for additional information about any of the unique services Arden Courts provides. You are listening to your host, Marcia Teal, an Alzheimer's disease and dementia care expert on CareGiverSolutions.info. If you have a question or wish to share a story, call into the show at 888-565-1470 and talk with Marcia. Now, back to Caregiver Solutions.
Welcome back. I'd like to take this opportunity to thank our national sponsor, Arden Courts Memory Care Community. Arden Courts is a leader in memory care for people that have all different kinds of dementia. And Arden Courts is a great resource, too, for you, the caregiver. They'd like to give this book to you just for tuning in and watching the show. It's called the 36-Hour Day book. It's a wonderful resource for caregivers. It has a lot of explanations. It has tips. It talks about challenging behaviors. If you don't have this book, I highly recommend you calling and getting it absolutely free. Arden Courts would like to provide this to you at no cost. All you have to do is call their toll-free number, which is 888-478-2410, and tell them that you heard about this offer on the Caregiver Solutions Info Show, and they'll be happy to get your name and address and make sure that they mail a book right out to you. Again, call them now, 888-478-2410, to get your free copy of the 36-Hour Day. So my guests today are from hospice, particularly Trustbridge Health Hospice, and we're talking about everything related to caregiving when you're dealing with hospice, to what's covered, what people need to know. And before we go today, Dr. Kennedy, we have a few minutes left. I can't let us end this show without touching on the actual dying process when someone is on hospice services and they become really like what you would call crisis care, where we know that the dying is imminent, and what a person goes through as far as are there any particular signs or symptoms, because I think it's important to talk about that for families to be a little bit more prepared.
I think the biggest struggle for families is the not eating. Eating is a social event. I see patients in the home, and when I walk into the home, they offer me something to drink. You gave me water when I came here. It's really a way that we show love. So I think the most difficult is when the families are watching somebody either refuse to eat. They're really not hungry, and I think that's the hard thing for us to understand. And I also think it's the first thing that kind of hits them to understand that this person's really ill, and it's really the first sign that things are not going well, and they're dying, and they're at the end of their life.
And families are distressed because, hey, you need to eat. I want you to eat. Don't you want to? And they kind of push and push, right? But it's not going to help anything because that person just is refusing.
No, and I just tell them this is where they get to be the princess and the prince. They get to decide what they want, and if they're not eating, they're choosing not to eat. So what I always say is that people will say, well, if they don't eat, they're going to die. And I say, well, they're not dying because they're not eating. They're not eating because they're dying.
Right.
Does that make sense?
Yes.
It's part of the natural process. And, we've been put together very, very intelligently. And that's part of one of the things that we do is the first thing that stops is the intestine. So if we overfeed them, they're not processing it and things are not going through. So the natural part is the brain is the captain of the ship and it starts shutting things down. And that's one of the first things that we see. That's why we're not really a proponent of peg and feeding tubes, not only for the dignity issue, because really eating is the last dignified thing they can do for themselves. And now you've taken that away. So also it causes a lot of pain and some other symptoms. So really that's a sign that the disease is progressing. Some other things you might see are a little agitation and restlessness. They'll have a change in their night and day. They get what I call uncomfortable in their own skin. They can't sit still. So that terminal agitation. They can even at the about 24 to 48 hours before they pass, they have what's called a terminal fever. They don't have an infection, it's a fever, and they'll spike a very high fever. So we treat those with Tylenol, just like we normally would, but it's not an infection, so we don't put antibiotics.
Something that you expect, so you know.
Yes.
They have also what we call terminal, so I'm using the word terminal because it's the very end, tachypnea, where they start breathing very quickly. Their oxygen levels are normal, but their brain is just not processing, so they start breathing quickly. So we do use narcotics
like
for that.
hyperventilating type of thing?
In a way. They breathe very quickly, more than 30 times a minute, and we do use morphine for that, and that scares people. We don't use it at high levels that you would, but just enough to reset your brain to slow the breathing down so the patients are a little bit more comfortable. And I think the most distressing thing is what people used to call the death rattle, which I don't really like. I call it terminal congestion. And that's when they have basically just spit in the back of their throat, and they're not able to swallow it. Exactly. So we have some medicines that will not dry it up, but it'll prevent more from forming. So one of the goals to do is try to kind of get on that and make sure that we can try to prevent that from happening.
And do you try to stop the rattle because it's hard for the caregivers to hear, or is it detrimental to the patient?
It doesn't bother the patients. They just breathe right through it, but it's really terrible for the families, and it's really one of the more distressing things. And so, again, it's about their journey. And I always say, if I can just make it a little bit better, I've done a lot for somebody sometimes. And people always ask me, how do you do hospice? And I say, how do I not do hospice?
You get more than you give every day. And that's exactly what I say, is if we can move the emotional experience for a family member 1 millimeter to make it easier.
You've done a lot.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
And Laura, you wanted to say a little bit about the family experience going through this. And thank you for that explanation, Doctor. That was very helpful.
She touched on a lot of it. The struggle with the food aspect. And in fact, you all have taught me that the food and beverage actually does more harm than good, because they can no longer take in those fluids. The fluid can gather in the lungs, gather around the heart, absolutely, and clearly those are things that we don't want at all. And I wanted to dovetail on the agitation that you see. You sometimes see people starting to talk to people that have predeceased them, and you see people sometimes looking at one particular area in the room, and sometimes you can ask them, what do you see? And they will talk about spiritual things. I'm a pretty science-based program, but having been at bedside for hundreds of people to take their last breath, there is an enormous spiritual component.
Well, I'm glad you said that, because I had an experience with one of our residents years and years ago, and he was on crisis care under hospice, and the wife was just sitting by his bedside, continuously. I walked in to sort of say my goodbyes, and she said, oh, he's been there, for like hours and hours and hours. And she was with him. And I walked in to say goodbye. And she says, well, he's asleep. And he had his eyes shut. And he goes, no, I'm not. And she couldn't believe it. So sometimes, they can hear you when you don't think they can hear you. So this is all so great. And I want to thank you both for coming in and giving us this wonderful information to help caregivers and other families. If someone saw or heard something they'd like to get more information, can they contact you?
Absolutely.
And how they call TrustBridge?
So the main number is 561-848-5200, and you can also go on the internet at trustbridge.com, and it will come up, and it's a very easy website, very user-friendly. But I think the take-home message is just remember, everything you do to somebody should be doing something for them. And in medical science, we can do a lot of things to people, but if we're not doing anything for them, that's really where you start drawing that line. Because if you're not helping, you're hurting.
I do love you. You say the most wonderful things, because when I'm talking to families, I said, and even with placing into an assisted living for memory care, I always say, you're not doing it to them, you're doing it for them.
So
thank
them.
you. Thank you for that. Thank you all for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you all for joining in. Don't forget, call to get your free 36-hour-a-day book, 888-478-2410. In the meantime, we'll be back, next week, same time, same place. But give somebody a hug, because they need it, and so do you. And we'll see you next time. Thank you again, and take care.
Thanks for joining us for this week's Caregiver Solutions with Marcia Teal. Join us next week as Marcia, who has 15 years of Alzheimer's disease and dementia care experience, brings you more needed information to help with the care of your loved one. This show can be seen again on caregiversolutions.info, and questions can be left on the site, which may be used on the program to help others. See you next week for more Caregiver Solutions.